I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Cecilia Edwards is a partner in Everest Group's consulting practice. With her strategy background, Cecilia leads the practice's IT and digital transformation initiatives. Thankfully, she completed the digital transformation of her home office earlier this year. Todd Hintz, managing partner, also in Everest Group's consulting practice, brings over 25 years of strategic service consulting experience across multiple industries and domains. Today, you'll find Todd self-isolating in Texas with his family and Tank, a family dog. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Todd. Take it away, Todd.
Good afternoon, everyone. We appreciate you joining us. This is, as you know, one of a mini series of presentations that we're going to kind of aid folks as they navigate the current environment. When we generally begin these sections, we always like to kind of ground folks in terms of expectations. Everything that we've seen because of the COVID crisis that we're seeing around the world is really an unprecedented disruption than we've ever seen. And what we mean by that is you're thinking through how do you navigate, how do you plan, how do you coordinate with your customers, with your partners, with internal folks, needs to kind of recognize the context that we're operating in. So the first thing is everything is changing in a way that we've never seen before in the past. The scope of things that are changing, from operations to the availability of our resources to shipping channels, everything simultaneously is changing. So the breadth and the scope of the challenge we've got in front of us is really unprecedented. The pace that's occurring as well, we've never seen before. So the speed of almost on a daily basis that we see how governments are reacting, how organizations are responding, is a very fluid environment. And as such, as we're thinking about how we counsel and how we work with others to navigate through this, we're really having to adopt an agile philosophy in terms of how both we plan, we think, and we execute on these things.
And so I think, Todd, that's a really good point. And I think one of the biggest things to think about when we think about how unprecedented this is we've prepared in the past for a location down, a city down, and even some instances a country down. But I don't think anybody's really prepared for the entire world down. And so that really leads, as Todd was talking about, this kind of agile approach to do this, that really does help us think through kind of what this journey looks like as people are migrating through this crisis. And people are at different stages, but I think we're all moving kind of in the same way. The first thing everybody had to focus on was the work from home scramble. I mean, nobody could have imagined, I know at least in the United States, when we were looking at what was going on in China and we saw, hey, people are being asked to stay home and not come to work and things like that. And you kind of go, can't even imagine that happening in the United States. But it only took a few weeks before we were in the same situation. And you saw counties and cities and then states start ordering everybody to work from home. And so this big work from home scramble. Fortunately, we're at a place where people have at least internet now and high-speed internet to the home. So that's put us in a really good position to be able to support that, at least in this country. And people have laptops that they can use. But there was a lot of scramble around ensuring people had the technology, the processes, et cetera, to be able to just enable those people to keep working from home. That was kind of stage one. We're in the US, we're 4 or 5 weeks into this, so most of us have moved through that process. Then the second stage was really resource continuity planning. As I mentioned, we've often prepared for what if a location goes down, but the whole globe, nobody really thought about that. And so backup systems that used to be, well, if something happens in California, we've got another location in New York. That doesn't quite work anymore because both California and New York are down. When I think about, hey, well, at least some of my systems are offshore, maybe they're in India. Well, now India's working from home as well. And so how do you actually think through the resource continuity? How do you get business going as much as you possibly can, given this current work environment? And that's kind of the second stage that most people have gone through, but some may still be in it, but that's stage two. When we think about where stage three is, Stage 3 is the response scramble. This is the time to start thinking through, what do I think the implications are going to be? So I've kind of handled as much of the fires as possible. How do I start looking forward? What do I think, how long is this crisis going to be? Where do I want to end up? How do I want to navigate my way through all of this of prepping the response? And we'll talk a lot more about this today, but stage 3 is response, because we're all trying to get to the 4th stage, which is really thinking through, what is that new normal going to be? How do I reset that? And so kind of this is the journey. And interestingly enough, we believe that most enterprises are somewhere between stage 2 and stage 3. And so we're going to kind of talk about that a bit today. And most of our conversation is going to be on stage 3. So before we get to the rest of the deck, talking about what's going to happen in stage 3, we do want to just kind of say, just in case you're in stage 2, we want you to remember to check some of these boxes. So you may have seen, if you attended one of our previous webinars, the one on Beyond Hand Sanitizer, you might have seen the slide already, right? Which is the thinking through of what are the things you need to make sure of. And it's worth repeating here, because even as you move into stage 3 and stage 4, I think the first one is still critically important. Ensure the health and safety of your employees and contractors. That is kind of first and foremost on everybody's mind. Just make sure the people are safe. And then you have to think about the operational preparedness, mitigations, and communicate. People are stuck at home, all sitting separately. And so communication has to be much more deliberate during this time period. So that's a little bit about where you are if you're in kind of stage 2. So now let's move a little bit to talk about really that whole stage 3. And again, we're keeping an eye out on where we're headed from a stage 4 perspective. And so we at Everest Group have this analogy that's been going around where we talk about how you take the curve matters. And so I'm going to use this racing analogy. And if you think about racing, you have the straightaways and you have the curves. Races are not won during the straightaway. They're actually won during the curve. So if you think about pre-COVID-19, things were normal. We knew exactly where things were going. That's kind of that straightaway. I think all of us agree now that we're in the middle of a big curve. This has thrown a significant curve to us, and how you navigate through it, how you position yourself, and how you prepare as you come out of this curve is going to really dictate a lot of things. And so that's kind of how I describe it. I think all of us have these different ways that we're describing this taking the curve analogy. And I think, Todd, you've got a different spin on it that you put when you're talking about how you take the curve.
Yeah, exactly, Cecilia. There's, I think also is if we kind of reflect upon the observations that Cecilia was sharing with us in terms of how we're preparing, how broad the disruption is. First of all, I advocate this won't be one curve, right? But really what we're trying to help folks orient themselves around is that there's going to be a series of curves that we're going to have to navigate. And generally when I thought about the application of the racing analogy and having actually talked to folks that kind of do that for a living, they say the most important thing that a driver has to do is to figure out what he wants to happen after the curve, right? So there are some folks that want to position themselves to actually be in a point of deceleration because there's a hill that's coming after the curve, a downward hill. There's others that want to position themselves to draft more effectively behind those that may be ahead of them. So every driver has a different outcome that they need to think about, right? Similarly, they need to recognize the capabilities of their own automobile, right? Some automobiles are absolutely built for curves better than others. And so the drivers have to really kind of think through two things. What capabilities and what's the status of their own vehicle and where do they want to be? And that kind of leads us to this next point of view. When we think about organizations and how they consider the navigation of the curve, there's a bit of some degree of self-awareness that they need to go through around who they are and where they want to be. And we're going to oversimplify the world for today's conversation, but we really see them kind of falling in 3 buckets. The first bucket is those that may be in a state of contraction. So their organization or their enterprise or their industry that they're currently in is being forced to rethink cost. They're being forced to think, how do I fortify my services and protect my market share, right? And their focus, where they're thinking about when they exit the curve, is potentially, how do I think about divestitures? How do I think of preserving clients long term? How do I think about getting the most out of the expenditures that I've placed in my shared services or my manufacturing facilities over a period of time? How do I get the most out of those? There are some organizations that are kind of in the middle. So they're not contracting, they're actually looking at growth, specifically organic growth. They think they're well positioned, they're good from a cash perspective, and they're asking themselves, how can I take advantage of today's environment to achieve new scale, to capture new demands? Now is the time to expand their share of their clients' wallets, right, or the market. And so they're really thinking, how do I do that with the set of tools and services that I have currently within my enterprise? And then there's kind of a third type of enterprise, and these are very aggressive organizations. They are extremely well positioned from a cash perspective. They're not only looking at organic growth, but they're looking at acquisitions, right? So they're thinking about, during this disruptive period of time, they know not everyone may make it through this. And so they're looking for value opportunities. They're looking for things that will complement their overall portfolio. And the quicker that they can navigate this turn, identify those targets, acquire them, and more importantly, the speed at which they can assimilate them into their organization is going to put them in a position that's going to be an envy of others. So I know this sounds obvious, but Cecilia and I are working with many organizations, and one of the things that always strikes us as interesting, but maybe not surprising, is not everyone in the enterprise has the same self-awareness, right? So the folks in IT versus the folks in finance and accounting versus the folks in the business units may have a very different perspective on where they're at. So one of the things that we're always advocating is, as we're helping folks put together their game plan on how to navigate this, is there's a very simple upfront set of conversations with your leadership teams that says, where are we and where do we want to go?
Yeah, you know, Todd, not to keep mixing metaphors, moving away from the racing one, but I've heard people often describe this as, we might all be in the same boat, but we're experiencing different storms. And so I think the analogy that you just gave is, if you're in the middle of a hurricane, you can't treat it like it's a light shower, right? And so really getting a good understanding of what storm you're actually facing is critically important.
Yeah, no, I like that analogy, because what you don't want to do is, you don't want to have your piece of the organization thinking that now's the time to row hard, and somebody else is saying, no, now's the time to start bailing water.
Right.
So you want to make sure absolutely that everyone's on the same page. And you know, once this kind of exercise of who you conduct around who you are, then I think you can move forward in terms of how you move forward. And I know we wanted to take a moment real quick and conduct a poll just for the folks that are currently on here, to get a good sense of where folks think they currently are. So I know we're going to give the audience here just a couple of minutes to kind of read through this. And remember, as you're thinking about where your enterprise is, pause, right? Don't think just about your department. Don't just think about your division. Think about your company as a whole, because chances are you're not navigating this just as a department. You're navigating this as your entire enterprise.
And this is the time to not be blinded, like not aspirationally, like realistically, where are you? Because everyone would aspire, you'd think, to have, you know, as much growth as possible. That's just not feasible for everybody. And so it does make sense to really think about this in a very strategic way. So I think we're going to leave this open for a couple more seconds before we close it. So we've got some good participation. I think we can go ahead and close this poll now. Interesting, nice mix. Todd, what do you think about this?
Yeah, no. Well, it's interesting. The mix is I'm interested how balanced it is. It's funny. It's when these things start and people start putting game plans together. We're often having to kind of show them why they're not as badly positioned as they may think they are. So it's funny. Generally, when we have the conversations, we see folks more conservative in terms of the assessment of the organization. I think it's healthy. I think seeing, normally what we would expect to see is a little bit more around contraction, just slightly a little bit more around organic growth, and some degree of uncertainty around we are best positioned to take an aggressive stance in the marketplace. But certainly I would say this distribution is not atypical of what we encounter. And what's interesting, I would even say, this is the type of portfolio when we talk to folks in finance and IT, shared services, supply chain business units. Interestingly enough, I think we typically anticipate seeing this type of distribution for the same company.
That's right. That's right. And there's a good reason why you see that. And if I think through, and we'll talk about this on the next slide a little bit, if we think through why you would see that wide distribution within a company, it's literally because it's hard sometimes for anyone to get the full picture. Just waiting for the next slide to come up just a little bit. When you think about where a disruption impacts you as an organization, and this can be any disruption, right? On this slide, we talk about civil unrest and earthquakes, et cetera. So this is not unique to COVID-19, except for the fact that this is a global disruption, right? Which kind of magnifies all of these things to another degree than if you just had a hurricane in a single location. But there's so much impact. There's the finances, the organization, legally. So all of this mix of risk that people are trying to think through. And then there's the impact on your operations and stakeholders. And all of this can start to get really overwhelming. And so you kind of think about, well, how do I deal with it? Where do I think through things? And so what we've done today is really, we've broken things down a little bit. And again, as Todd mentions, we like to simplify things a bit. And so the tactical approach that we've taken is really to let's look at what are some things, and these are coming out of lessons from the past two recessions. And I don't necessarily like to think of this as a recession yet, because we don't have an economy that's open. We have a disrupted economy. And once we get it started, we're likely to go into some type of recession for some period of time. But the reason I make that distinction is the unprecedented nature of having a disruption and how major an impact that is. Causes everybody. It causes the financial institutions, the rating institutions, stakeholders, everybody to really take a hard look. When you talk about having a one-time extraordinary event, right? This is where we are today. And so we've tried to break this down into three groups. So what we've learned from some of the recessions, however, as we think through how you want to come out of this curve, there are typically three strategies that organizations take. One strategy is, let me cut cost. And when we talk about cutting costs, this is just, everybody's heard this. You get the notice that says all budgets are slashed 25%, like uniformly, right? Companies that take that approach tend to fare less well. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but they fare less well. The second group says, boy, I've got cash. Let me spend, right? And see if I can't steal some share. Those people fare better than the folks that only focused on cost cutting, but they actually aren't the best performers coming out on this straightaway. The best performers are those folks who think about smart cost cutting, increased efficiency, and strategic investments. And so this framework that we have here, the things in light blue, those are the things that are really around smart cost cutting. The things in the middle are things that drive increased efficiency, both within IT, within your business processes, and within your organization. And the things on the right are the types of strategic decisions that you need to make. Today, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the three on the left-hand side. We'll get to some of the others in future webinars that we're doing, but we really want to spend a little bit of time talking about these three types of activities. And so when I think about those, we really, these are in the cost bucket. So how you take out costs really does matter. So this is clearly, you know, my bias already, a 25% budget cut across the entire organization is not exactly the smartest way. The reason that isn't is because it violates what we think are the critical success factors for strategic cost cutting. The first one is you have to preserve the ability to deliver value today. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to do something that says, boy, I can't even deliver to my existing customer base the value proposition that they want today, or the one that I was delivering yesterday. So how do I contract but not eliminate my ability to deliver value today? You could go do some of that cost cutting, but you might also impact your ability to deliver in the future. If you already know where the market is headed, to cut costs on things that prevent you from delivering capability that you're going to need as soon as the recovery begins, that's also not really a strategic way to think about cutting costs. And the third one is really to look at things that you want to cut costs in a way that helps increase your competitiveness through efficiency. So if there are smarter ways to cut costs that help improve your efficiency, when you come out of the curve, your cost basis is going to be much more competitive and much more sustainable. So those are the things that we like to think through as we're talking about how we look at cutting costs. And so, you know, Todd will take us through some of the details of the first batch of cost cutting ideas that we have.
Yeah, and Cecilia, I think you're raising a good point, and if I could add just one thing to it, Cecilia did a great job of kind of talking about the how and to make sure that you're preserving future options. The one thing I do want to remind everybody as well is there's the importance of when. As we know, markets are going to provide some level of forgiveness, if you will, on enterprises' financial performance, most likely in this quarter and the upcoming quarter. And we know that organizations will be able to take sort of extraordinary charges to navigate their way through this unprecedented type of impact that we're occurring. So it's not only important that you kind of heed Cecilia's advice, you've got to think through the how and make sure you don't do it in a destructive manner. But I would also encourage you, as you're talking to your enterprises, you not only need to act quickly because some of these things take time, but you need to act quickly because the market has a very short memory, right? And so they will allow a certain level of forgiveness if you take on these actions, and you can kind of report those costs soon. But next year, presumably we navigate our ways through these. If that's when you choose to make investments to reduce cost, you're most likely not going to not receive the same level of forgiveness.
That's right.
So if we move forward, we'll kind of look at one of a collection of levers that exists for us. And one area that we encourage folks to look at is within their managed services and managed services agreements that they've got with third parties. There are often ample areas where you can reduce cost. And we've got kind of our pro tip there. This isn't around squeezing anyone, right? And so go back to what Cecilia kind of laid in front of us early on. This is the type of change that we haven't seen before, right? It's not that we're being impacted on one side of the world and we can shift risk to another part that may not be receiving the same type of impact, right? So simply just squeezing rates, things that we did in 2008, things that we did in 2014, we can try to do them, but basically what we're seeing now is organizations are finding that they're not being as successful in those manners. So let's kind of dig into some of the various options that you've got in front of you. And what I would tell you is we try to provide a balanced perspective on those things that you can look at, right? So I'll always encourage our enterprise clients to look internally first. What are the things that are immediately within their control that they can do that can lower their overall operating costs? One of the first ones is around demand management, right? So as Cecilia said, we're telling everyone to be prepared for that call for reduction in cost. And discretionary spending around certain projects are one of the first things that you want to take ownership of and say, can we delay this? Can we cancel it? Or can we reduce the overall effort? That'll have an impact not only on your resources, but also the typical partners that you rely upon.
Yeah, and Todd, there's a can we, but there's also a should we.
Yeah.
Right? Because you technically you can stop just about anything, but the should we, you want to think through which things are going to go back to our criteria, which things are going to have an impact on your ability to deliver future value, and which things are going to have an impact on your ability to increase your overall efficiency.
Yeah, no, that's right, Cecilia. And with each one of these, I would encourage you guys to kind of take that that litmus paper that Cecilia is talking about and kind of hold it up and understand the impact that it can create. Because depending upon your organization, depending upon your function, the impact of demand management may not hold the same results in IT as it will within F&A. Another thing that we say is kind of well within your control is your channels, right? How services are delivered. You may have multiple channels and multiple vehicles where the service can be realized. And one of the things that we're encouraging folks to do is really accelerate or emphasize a lot of the self-service channels that a lot of you guys have already built, but you have not been very draconian in pushing your users to those areas. And that's a good area that I think most people kind of understand. It allows them to operate more effectively in our 24/7 world. Hopefully, we've done a good job of educating our customers, our employees on how to use them. And chances are they actually get better service and better responsiveness in those areas. Other things that we can begin to think about, and now we start to blend over into that Venn diagram of where it impacts both the enterprise and the suppliers, we can think about changing our service coverage. A lot of services that we have for our enterprise clients today are 24/7. And in today's environment, if reducing certain costs that are non-destructive in nature is a priority, we're seeing a number of our enterprise clients choose to really calibrate down those service coverage hours for specific types of activities. Another example similar to service coverage is not only the time, but those white glove services, right? So for those services that were meant for special executives within our organization, we're starting to move them to a more common service channel as well. There are conversations and sometimes difficult conversations you're going to have with the suppliers. You may need to reconsider the on-offshore ratio of the solution. And that doesn't mean accelerating or increasing the offshore, right? It may mean just the opposite. I may want to lower my overall service levels. I may want to reduce my service coverage, but for proximity reasons, I may choose to increase the delivery method from an onshore basis as well. I know we said the pro tip, it's not always in the rates, but certainly rates are one of those things that you should press on. Hopefully you'll have a good interactive conversation. Sometimes these can be achieved directly. Other times they can be achieved by examining whether or not we've overskilled on our solution. And sometimes it can be answered through the advancements in robotics that your suppliers may have made in some of these areas. So those are just kind of a handful of the things that we think that are readily available for you guys to address the costs. And I'm so grateful for Cecilia. She always reminds me for each one of these, kind of recognize what they are, identify whether or not they're going to have a destructive impact, and always go back to those first principles of who am I and where do I need to be, and how does pulling these levers enable me to accomplish my outcomes.
Great. So Todd, how about we take a poll again?
Yeah, that's a good idea. So we've kind of busted these up into a combination of levers that can be pulled. And you'll see some of these are directly around the things that are happening within your organization, and others require you to interact with the supplier. So we're going to give you a couple of seconds here to kind of mull over these. And then once we do get past these types of options, we're going to put a second poll in front of you that looks through what are other things that you can do. And you'll see there's even a stronger bias in the second poll around core activities that your suppliers can help you with.
Yeah, so let's keep this open for a couple more seconds to see a few more answers that are still coming in. So, all right, why don't we look at the results of these really quickly?
All right, so that's great. I mean, so that's what we call in terms of prioritizing that service performance. I think that's a very healthy. It can be, and most often is, a non-destructive type of approach. And I think, you know, when you think about your partners, when you think about your end customers, and the breadth of the pandemic impacts that we are seeing today, I think everyone understands that performance as a whole will be changing until we can kind of, if you will, as an overall industry, navigate the curve that is in front of us. Certainly, and it's great to see that assessing rates wasn't the predominant one. All right, I think we're gonna look at the next set, and as you can see, this next set can be more far-reaching, right? And we tried to also kind of segment these things that we think the previous set were things that you could do relatively quickly. In this set, we think may take a little bit more time, but obviously can have a bigger impact. So we're going to leave
I think if you look at the last one, you know, many of those things would not necessarily significantly impact your delivery model. This actually starts to do that, right? If I think about rationalizing suppliers and self-service, and I'm starting to do things that might actually change how I deliver the services as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And as everyone is kind of thinking these through, when Cecilia and I, we've done this exercise and actually digging into organizations, the data, not only the cost, the volumes of services that they're being supported, the transactions. We often see that eventually when you really start to prioritize these things, you have to kind of think about it in terms of 3 dimensions. There's the impact that it can have to your organization. There's the time to realize the impact, and then there's the risk, right? The risk of destruction.
Yeah.
I think it looks like we're getting most of the
yes, I think go ahead and look at the results now.
Good. This is perfect. Yeah, no, yeah, I love to see it when we've got kind of when you're thinking about levers, there's not a preponderance or bias towards, you know, let's just attack the rate card. Let's just you know, really think about only pulling the on-offshore lever tighter and harder. So I think this is great. This is what we would hope to see folks execute a more diversified, broad set of levers, and hopefully in a manner that really begins to minimize any destructive impact that could result to the enterprise.
Absolutely. And when you look at these sets of things, these are starting to be the things that take cost out that are unnecessary. So I think that one of the things that's happening with this COVID-19 crisis is we're starting to establish some new business norms. So one of those was, for example, increasing of self-service. With everybody at home, we're having a self-service. And so people are going to understand that they've got more capability to do that in the future. And so things that were previously deemed as, oh, our users won't buy it. I think a lot of those excuses go away, and that we figured out that we can still efficiently operate with different models. So I think that's one of the lessons. So the next category of things that we can look at are really the technology and business process transformation. So the things that Todd mentioned were around the relationship with the service provider and how you manage them. Now, this is looking at the scope a bit. And so one of the things that we know is significant savings can be seen if you go across each of the towers. And so as we step through these, I am not going to kind of go through each one of these in gory detail, but just want to highlight a couple of things. If we look at cloud and data center, this is one where from a risk perspective, we think you're going to see a lot of movement as people accelerate the movement to the cloud. And so you see things like consolidation and virtualization and containerizing and automating. These things can have a 30% cost savings. So you don't lose any functionality, you actually can increase quality and speed while pulling a significant amount of cost out. And then if you combine that with thinking about the processes, even how Todd talked about demand management, cloud consumption governance, that's another flavor of demand management. You can get another 8% there. Right. And so as you think about how you do these things, it's again, the smart cost takeout. You don't have to incur these costs because you're not actually getting a bang for any of the money that you're spending on these kinds of things. You move to the next tower. We look at workplace. Everybody has thought that this conversation is old school, played out, and it just isn't. As you start thinking about moving to the cloud, as we start thinking about things being SaaSified, as you think about people working remotely, the model for workplace has got to change as well. So you see things like virtual desktop infrastructures, zero incidents and shift left, all these kind of channel mix things from a business process. You get significant amount of cost savings as you start to think about the delivery model. So let's move on now to look at apps, for example. From an applications perspective, obviously the SaaSification of things, but even using open source. Why does everything have to be proprietary? Looking at analytics engines, all of these things. Everybody knows about the moving of Agile and DevOps. Well, you can get up to 25%, somewhere between 10 and 25%, just by changing the process that you use to get the same value out of it. And last but not least, you have to look at security. This is one where as we're doing this has got to be a CISO's worst nightmare to have every single user doing their business from home.
Yeah.
Like no control theoretically when you think about the old school way of doing security. But now they're having to think about automated vulnerability assessments, right? Digital investigations of forensics, putting standards and process improvements, all these kinds of things, because you have to do security remotely now. And the ability to do that is going to loom large in the long term as well. So that was just a quick note to say, looking at those towers and really thinking strategically, technology-wise and business process-wise, really can drive a lot of cost savings, but at the same time improve efficiencies and processes so you don't lose any functionality or capability. As a matter of fact, you probably gain.
Cecilia, I think I've heard you talk to others about this. It's really generally not just one category. It's kind of a combination
right.
across all of these. So you haven't presented these guys with a list, go do these things. Given your environment, who you are, where you want to go, there's some kind of surgical things that you're going to have to do to get your organization there.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Again, which boat, which storm, right? People often come to us and say, what is the answer?
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is until I know what your problem is, right? And so we look at these things. That's why there's a cost range, right? We have to look at this situation, and then some of these you're not going to get any bang for doing them. Some you're going to get a tremendous amount of impact, and it really is think through which ones make the most sense for you. Which ones can you do that help you with the risk profile that you're trying to maintain, et cetera. So.
Good.
So with that, let's talk about a few key takeaways. I think we've talked about a number of things. And the first one that we have, Todd, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, so this is, we kind of pushed off with Cecilia's analogy on how do we take the curve. And this is the one thing on today's discussion that I hope of all the things, this is the thing that you remember, because you're going to have a conversation with peers, you're going to have a conversation with other functional leaders, and everyone's going to kind of jump in and say, here's the things we got to do. Before you move forward, you have to check two things in a self-awareness kind of way. One, where are we at, right? What is our current position of our organization collectively, not just my department, but across the enterprise? And then number two, where do we want to be when we exit the curve? What are our goals? Do we want to be in a position to capture additional market share? Do we want to acquire? Do we need to fortify and defend our current client base? You really need to take that step first.
Great. So our second key takeaway is really partnering with your service providers. This is not the time to do battle. I think Todd mentioned, that you could try to squeeze your service providers as much as possible, but the fact of the matter is they're in the same boat as you, and collectively you have to figure out how to move through this. And so the idea is partnering with your service providers to think through the things that you can collectively do to take out all those unnecessary costs. And finally, we have the idea around gaining increased savings and efficiencies by optimizing. If you think about optimizing the technology and processes of each IT tower. And now is the time to do that and to move quickly, because as we mentioned, this is a one-time extraordinary event. And some of these things, in order to take advantage of them, you are going to need to spend some money. Now, there's some options like service provider funding and things like that that can help, but the fact of the matter is, if you invest now, the probability that your investors and the rating agencies, et cetera, and from an accounting perspective, that you get to fold this in to an extraordinary event is highly likely that you can do that if you act now. If you wait until things are great and you've recovered, then it's going to go straight to your margins. It's going to hit your margins. It's not going to be seen as an extraordinary event. Yeah. So with that, we'd like to talk to you about just a few complimentary offerings. As you may know, Everest Group has our saying is that we're with you on the journey. And so the idea around these special offers is really to support you in that way. And so all these offerings are complimentary. You just need to let us know if you're interested. The first one is really around assessing your readiness for recovery. So this is a quick survey and conversation with us where we can really compare where you are to other things that we're seeing in the markets and peers, et cetera, and help you do an assessment across these dimensions to gauge where your readiness is for the recovery. Our second one is really, there's a broader set of topics. So this is a little less structured, broader set of topics that have to do with recovery. We've identified some that we've heard that are high priority. You could suggest another, and request a complimentary session with one of our senior leaders to actually hear a little bit about where you are and have a specific one-on-one conversation about things that you might be able to do. And then finally, for those people who might still be in that second phase a little bit, we have an offering. It's just a tool that you can download that is a business continuity business impact analysis. Oftentimes the business continuity discussions don't actually get all the way to business impact. This tool allows you to step through and think through and quantify the business impact of the things that you might want to do from a business continuity planning perspective. This will help justify budgets and prioritize actions that you may want to do. So those are the 3 offers that are available to us. You can certainly, during this session, let us know which ones of these offers might be of importance to you or that you might be interested in. We'll also be following up afterwards with those. While you guys are filling this out, we'll just leave this up for a little bit. We can start the question and answer session if you guys have questions that you would like to start throwing our way. And you'll have to give us a second to look through. Todd,
Yep.
Do you see any questions that we should start with?
No, I saw a question and I thought it was a good one. Certainly when we were conducting the polls, there was a question around sort of the demographics of today's participants. You know, the subtext in the broader question was, you know, sometimes when we've seen public polls done in the past, a lot of times there are certain folks in various service industries that have a more aggressive, more positive, more optimistic, sometimes our questionnaire said unrealistically optimistic kind of point of view. And I think what I would say is this person might be surprised. The majority of today's participants represent what we would call traditional enterprises. So not service providers. So these are folks that are not what I would say incented or positioned to think about how do I grow an opportunity based upon today's challenges. This is a heavily weighted webinar with enterprise specific participants.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think that the surprising nature of those answers, again, goes to Todd, what you said when we were in the middle of having that discussion. Depending upon where you're sitting in the organization, you're going to have a different perspective. And one of the things that we think is interesting is how do you make sure that your entire leadership team is actually on the same page? Yeah. We find this continuously. I mean, even just the work I've been doing over the last couple of years on digital transformation, everybody knows we need it. But how inconsistent the belief and perspectives of the senior leadership team are really is one of the biggest barriers to slowing that down. I would assume that you have a similar situation here, that the lack of total cohesion amongst that senior leadership team might actually start to impede how you think about the recovery. And so, you know, having a deliberate exercise to gain alignment certainly is worth it.
Yep.
Okay. So let's see. Here's another question, and Todd, you can probably take this. What do you predict will happen to offshore outsourcing and offshore heavy service providers as we emerge from this crisis?
Yeah, no, I love that question. I was like, you know, if I were really accurate, I wouldn't be here doing this webinar. I would have already predicted all of this. But it's a great question, and it's one we have to consider. And in my point of view is that the prediction or where we need to plan isn't just focused on offshoring or leveraging third parties. I think what we're seeing, because of, again, the breadth and the depth of the pandemic, is diversification is important, right? So the world is going through this, but what we're seeing is regions are progressing at different paces. The impact in different regions are different. It is highly imperative that when we think about our critical operations, we have to be able to move our work to where it can be performed, right? So that's number one. Number two, I think the way it's going to encourage both enterprises and third parties is to work more effectively on BCP activities, right? So not just traditional DR, but how do we respond to when we see these big influences, whether it's on labor, around technology, tariffs are going to change. How do we, as a partnership, work through these. So what I think, if I could lay a prediction out there, I think we're going to see stronger partnerships form between the enterprises and the third parties. I think we're going to see enterprises now begin to adopt their own delivery models that look like service providers. So I think we're going to see a growth around the global in-house centers. And I think we're going to see both parties absolutely press for things to be moved to the cloud, to have that built-in redundancy, and move more and more things into an automated environment, where in the past we've relied upon arbitrage to perform the tactical, non-judgmental activities. I think there's going to be a big push to get those things automated in the future.
And Todd, I would just add to that also, to eliminate the single point of failure from humans. Right. Yeah. Oftentimes we actually think about, well, here is my single expert on this. That's a luxury that I don't think we can afford any longer, because what if something happens to that person, they get sick, right? And so when you're starting to think about redundancy, a lot of times the relationships with service providers, you pass all of the capability to one side or the other. And I think having more of a partnership so that some of that knowledge is shared from a redundancy perspective is going to be important as well. So I think we have time for maybe one more. Todd, do you see another question that we can, I'll give us a sec.
Yeah, it is a good question that's thrown out there. And you were kind of talking about CISOs going crazy in this current environment. And the question is really kind of getting to an important question that we should be working with our service providers around. It's basically saying, with many of the service providers that are operating offshore, they've got kind of a challenging environment as it relates to work from home. And it was asking us, basically, how are folks navigating concerns around security? How are they navigating concerns around availability of infrastructure, i.e. broadband? And do we think this is going to be a sustainable solution in the long term if we're not able to overcome the restrictions that the current environment are placing on us? And so it's kind of a multi-faceted question. So one, what we're seeing is service since the preponderance of folks are enterprise organizations on this call, what I would say is be prepared for your service providers to acknowledge that they had BC plans in place. It was either around how they would get employees to work or how they would shift the work to a different location. But given the pandemic, both of those options have become marginalized. And so now they have folks working from home. And so the question is when their home environment does not have, like mine, I've got open windows, right? So someone from the street can kind of see in. Well, that certainly violates some of the security protocols that the service provider agreed to. And the question that they're going to ask is, how do we become indemnified against this risk? Or how do we share this risk? So if you're an enterprise and you haven't already had that conversation, you should be prepared on how to answer it. And then the second portion of the question, if we do not find a vaccine or a cure, or if this becomes a longer term concern, what are sort of the answers? How will providers kind of navigate this? And what we are seeing is they're starting, as Cecilia said, they're starting to move to system and technology advancements that are addressing where bandwidth is available within their delivery centers. They're starting to look about those things versus just hours of operation. So we have seen the service providers become very clever, very insightful around the constraints and how they are now exhibiting patterns and addressing and moving their delivery model against those patterns in a way that will meet the enterprise's needs. But that's a great question, and I think, quite frankly, we've got to be continuing to ask ourselves sort of what this gentleman was asking: how do we ensure that we work with our partners? Because chances are the solutions, the restrictions, the evolution of this impact is not a straight line. it's going to be a consecutive series of corners that we've got to figure out how to navigate through.
So I think that's all we have time for questions that we have time for. One of the things we'll let you know is that we will try to answer all of these questions either individually, but some of them probably are worth us shooting a quick video or something like that and putting that out there on our YouTube channel. And so we'll find a way to answer as many of these questions as possible afterwards. We do encourage you to take a moment, if you have, to visit our COVID-19 Resource Center on everestgrp.com/COVID-19, or you can get to it from the homepage of our website. We have lots of information there from the interviews that we've been doing both with enterprises and service providers. I mean, we're having conversations daily. We've got podcasts, executive briefings, webinars, I mean, as many resources as we can possibly put there to help you on the journey. And again, we will follow up with you on those special offers, so you'll be hearing from us. So thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Alex.
Excellent. Thank you, Cecilia, and thanks, Todd. And thanks to everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with the link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. On behalf of Everest Group, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.